In this second video on the history of American art, we'll look at the 20th century. Certainly with the growing wealth of the early 20th century, rich Americans began to collect original classic sculptures and paintings, no longer relying on, say, plaster casts made from the originals or copies as many had earlier. Possessing the original and perhaps loaning it to museums for public consumption was a way of distinguishing themselves. A number of wealthy industrialists amassed amazing collections of art, and philanthropy grew. During the Progressive Era, the Smithsonian Museum, which had existed since the mid-19th century and contained relatively few pieces of art, was officially recognized as holding a, quote, national gallery of art, and they began to actively acquire new pieces. Like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the National Gallery of Art remains today one of the world's most famous museums of art. By the early 20th century, photography had begun to emerge as a new form of art. Photographic art manipulated angles, presenting objects in different light, often items not seen as subjects for art before. It blurred and changed focus. When color photography emerged, black and white photography remained in vogue as an artistic form. A bit later in the 20th century, Ansel Adams became probably America's most famous art photographer with his black and white images of nature, harkening back to the landscape paintings of the 19th century, only now nature's majesty depicted in photography. During the 1920s, African American painters were a key part of the famous Harlem Renaissance. Henry Ossawa Tanner, shown here on the left, became famous worldwide with his paintings of African American life. Art in the Harlem Renaissance included not just painting, but sculpture. One artist, Medevo Warwick, and you can see her on the bottom left there, sculpted in 1921 Ethiopia, which is on the immediate right there. And that combined forms of sculpting, including those back to ancient Egypt. You can see it in the bottom of that sculpture there. A defining characteristic of many Harlem Renaissance artists, whether in music, painting, or other forms, was a hearkening back to Africa. During the Great Depression and the New Deal of the 1930s, a new school of art grew, the social realism school. It had less of a romantic or classical feel than the earlier Ashcan school, and while it too portrayed scenes of everyday urban life, its intent was to highlight the contribution and plight of the working class. Many artists in this school saw their art as a way to help transform society and make it more equitable. Social realism could manifest in different ways, some paintings rather abstract, as shown here. Now, abstraction in art was not new. The artist may have a real object in mind when painting, but that object might be stylized, distorted, or exaggerated using colors and textures to communicate a feeling rather than produce an exact replica. The beauty of shapes and colors often overrode representational accuracy. Now, a degree of abstraction was evident in earlier tonalism, of course, and to a lesser degree even in some luminism and impressionism. But by the mid-20th century, abstraction had become all the rage and exploded. An extreme form of abstraction in art was abstract expressionism, which began as early as the 1940s. It was completely unrelated to objects, but rather sought to stimulate the unconscious, to conjure up imagination and emotion in its viewers. The most famous of the abstract expressionists was Jackson Pollock. An iconoclastic, alcoholic, and reclusive individual, Pollock would pour or splash liquid household paint onto a horizontal surface, enabling him to view and paint his canvases from all angles. It was also called all-over painting, or action painting, because he used the entire canvas and the force of his whole body to paint, often in a frenetic dancing style. This extreme form of abstractionism divided the critics, some praising the immediacy of his paintings, while others derided the random effects. With all the innovation in art during the mid-20th century, people began to speak of a broad term, modernist art. Modernist art is sort of an umbrella term and is difficult to define. In a general sense, traditional art had been about perfect, seamless technique, and using that perfect, seamless technique to execute well-established subject matter. 18th century portraiture, 19th century landscape paintings, and the Ashcan School, and the work of John Singer Sargent, all were examples. So-called modernist art, by contrast, was sort of a rebellion against formulaic art. It was more about a personal expression, the artist's individual vision. Modern art, therefore, expanded what was considered art and put great emphasis on being original and doing things innovatively. The spread of abstraction in painting was a key example. With its emphasis on the artist's individual expression and attempt to evoke emotion, much of the modern art could be futuristic, often exhibiting a positivist or a utopian vision. Modernist art spread among many art forms, from photographic art to sculptures, often experimenting with new materials. Probably the best example, the most famous of the modern artists was not American but Spanish, Pablo Picasso. When it comes to American modernism, often considered the mother of American modernism was the painter Georgia O'Keeffe, who began painting as early as World War I. Among others, O'Keeffe, shown in the bottom left here, was known for her paintings of flowers. O'Keeffe began painting New York skyscrapers, but later traveled around the United States, most notably expanding her art in New Mexico, where she experimented in Hispanic, Native American, and Western art. Today there's a Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe. Eventually, of course, modernist art produced a reaction. Today, art historians speak of another broad umbrella term to describe this late 20th century response: Post-Modernism. Again, however, the term's quite broad and in a general sense difficult to define. Rejecting the centrality of the artist's individual expressionism, so important to modernists, postmodernists often sought skepticism and irony, not utopianism or a positivist agenda. There were no universal truths or unifying themes. Postmodernists sought to evoke thought, and again dramatically expanded what before had been considered art. Postmodernism often represented philosophical critiques of modern culture, or simply art for art's sake. It was avant-garde. Postmodernists created performance art, or video art, or multimedia art, often crossing traditional art forms such as acting, poetry, and dance. Seeking to make a point or provoke thought, postmodernists might use environmental materials, objects found in nature, or, rather, mundane man-made objects ubiquitous in modern society. Some postmodernists have been defined as minimalist, their art seeking as little color or shapes as possible, rejecting the overt modernist expressionism with simplicity. Another form of postmodernism was so-called pop art, which sought images from mass or popular culture to challenge or distinguish between high and low culture, or simply to critique modern consumerism. Of course, the most famous example of pop art was the eccentric 1960s artist Andy Warhol, and you can see him on the bottom left. The growing popularity of contemporary art in all of its forms, modernist to postmodernist, led to the founding of the famous Guggenheim Museum in New York City, which specialized in such art and whose building, designed by the famed architect Frank Lloyd Wright, reflected its purpose. The Guggenheim, along with the Metropolitan Museum and the National Gallery of Art, comprise the most famous art museums in America. Today, art, like so many other aspects of creative culture such as music and literature, remains a huge business. Major auction houses, such as Christie's or Sotheby's, regularly buy and sell famous artwork for tens of millions of dollars. Wealthy collectors also arrange private sales. But art remains a key aspect of American culture beyond just the wealthy. Folk art, for example, is still tremendously popular. For example, with the growth of Hispanic Americans, colorful Mexican-centric art is popular today. Art festivals, often with food and music, are common in most American cities. Americans' love of art is even evident in widespread street art, legal or otherwise. In any event, this concludes the second and last video on the history of American art.